For those of you who are wondering the nature of the marker board up here, I thought to keep you awake we might do a little Pictionary. So since Baptists used to have bulletins that they doodled in while the preacher preached, and you don't have that anymore, you may have some pin-up, that you need to express yourself. Now, we're going to use this as a teaching tool along the way, but I have been told that somebody might be interested in the rest of the story from last Sunday about the lost cell phone. Any of you really care about that? Yeah, I hate to take away from today's teaching time, and maybe I can make up some connection to what we're doing today, but were you all here last week and heard the first part of the story? Everybody was here? Okay, all right, yeah. All right. So I'm standing in the parking garage at the airport, realizing I've lost my cell phone, and what is plan B at that point? And my mind was actually going crazy. But I thought I didn't have time on my side. The only options were forget the flight, go back and get the phone, and drive to Maryland, 9 hours. And I'm thinking, nah, that's not a good plan. I will figure it out. And so I go into the airport, and I'm sweating profusely because now my nerves are on edge about how I'm going to do this. And I go to the ticket counter, and thankfully there was nobody in line at the ticket counter. And so I showed my driver's license, and I explained what happened, and she printed me out a boarding pass. So I thought, well, obstacle number one is cleared. I'm going to get on this flight. And so I go get to the security line. Well, it's a mile long. And so I'm standing there sweating profusely, working my way through the line, trying to think, how am I going to do this? How am I going to do this? How am I going to do this? So I get through the security, get back to the gate, and I look at the board up there, and it's 20 minutes till boarding time. So I've got 20 minutes, but the previous flight has not arrived yet, so we're not going to get off on time. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, there are people in Maryland that are expecting me. There are people that are providing me a place to stay. There are people who have prepared a meal expecting me to show up at 8:30 to eat it. There's a family that we're doing the service for that they're going to wonder where I am and if I made it or not. How am I going to communicate without this cell phone? And so there was a young man sat down next to me, and I kept looking at him, and he was reading a book, and then he had his cell phone out, and he was reading a book, and had his cell phone out, and I finally leaned over to him and said, would you do me a favor? He said, what's that? I said, would you text my wife and let her know that I left my cell phone at home? He said, would you like to call her? I said, well, certainly. So he gave me his phone. Now, there are four, I'm going to call these minor miracles. You sort of categorize them. The first one is that I knew my wife's cell phone number. I don't know anybody else's, okay, besides mine. I knew her because at this stage of life, we felt enough paperwork on each other that we knew that. So that was the first one. Number two is that my wife actually had her phone on her because most of the time she does not know where it is, correct? She does not know. The third minor miracle was that it was charged up because most of the time her phone is dead somewhere. What are y'all laughing about? The next one was that she actually answered to a phone number that she did not know and said hello. And I explained to her briefly, I said, I left my cell phone there. Here's the security code to get into my phone. Go to my contact information and look up Brenda, find Brenda's number, call her, and tell her what happened. I lost my phone. I left my phone at home. I will meet her at her house. Brenda's instructions were she was going to meet me at the house I was going to be staying in. The address for that was in my cell phone. Did me no good. And so call her and do that. So it's like I rested assured that that was the best I could do and boarded the plane. Well, the plane was not completely full, but it was full enough that they had to rearrange the passengers to have so many between these rows and these rows and these rows and these rows. And so I'm sitting there, and we're like an hour late getting off the ground. Got people in Maryland expecting me at 8:30, and now it's already 7:30. So we get off the ground. We have turbulent weather flying there. And of course, my mind is racing ahead. I hope everything works out. And we get to Baltimore, there are thunderstorms. And so you don't land in turbulent weather. So we circled Baltimore area for an hour. And we finally land, and by this time, it's like 10 o'clock. And so I'm thinking, now, my rental car information is where? It's in my cell phone. I hope I remember which company I've rented from. So I take the shuttle from the airport out to the car rental place, and I go in and go to Alamo. I said, I think I have a reservation. He pulled it up. He said, sure enough, here it is. Here's your car. And I rented a midsize, and a midsize means I still have to fold myself up to get into it. But anyway, I was happy. I'm on the road. I'm making my way. So I go out to where Brenda lives, and she lives sort of in the woods, not in a highly. So I go to her house, and the lights are all on, and there are two cars in the driveway, and I go to the side door, which they always used, and I pecked on it, and nobody answered. And I pecked on it, and nobody answered. I went around to the front door, and the doorbell was all taped up, which means don't ring the doorbell. I get that. So I tapped on the front door, and nobody answered. All right, what am I going to do? Her twin sister lives next door, but not immediately next door. I had to drive out one long driveway into another long driveway, and I go to her twin sister's house. And her twin sister used to be on our worship team. I go up, and she had a Ring doorbell. Now, you know what a Ring doorbell is. That's the one where you can actually see who's out front. And so I ring that thing, and nobody answers the door. And so I get back in this rental car, and it's like, who do I know that I can go to their house at 10:30 at night, and they're going to have Brenda's contact information? And so I drive out, and I get back to the main road, and a car pulls in, heading back down to where I came from. I think, well, maybe that's somebody that knows her, and I can catch them, and we can do this. So I turn around, but I lost them going back in. I went to the twin sister's house, pulled up out front, and she came out on the front porch at that time. And she said, Pastor James, is that you? And I said, yes, it's me. She said, stay right there. I'm going to get my car and lead you to where Brenda is. And so she gets out. She leads me to Brenda. Brenda and her husband tried to wait up. Her husband had gone home and gone to bed. He was asleep when I was knocking on the door. And so she got the food out that had been cooked at 8:30, warmed it up so I could have something to eat, and explained to her what happened. She says, I'm going to leave you my cell phone in case you need to call somebody. Well, I don't know anybody's phone number to call, but in case I need to call somebody. So she leaves me that, and she says, here's my husband's work computer. He had an office at this house, and she said, here's the logon information so you can take care of any business you need online. I think, okay, good night, thank you, Brenda. So I go down to the computer, and I think, okay, number one is I need to do early boarding for tomorrow night. And so I don't have that information because that's all in my phone. So I'll go to my email and find all that confirmation on my email. So I go to try to log on to Gmail. Guess what it uses for logging on? Cell phone confirmation. It sends you a code on your phone to let you know that it's you. Yeah, thank you. And so I called the airline. I said, can we do this old school? Sure, fine, we'll check in. And I'm thinking, okay, the next thing is I need to somehow reach out to the family and let them know. And so I think, well, I'll Facebook, because I'm Facebook friends with the brother that invited me here. So I go to Facebook. Guess what verification it uses? Cell phone verification too. I can't log on to Facebook and do any. And so I'm thinking, I can't do any more tonight. I'm going to have to wait and take care of this in the morning. And so in the morning I get up, I call the funeral home. I said, the family's wondering where. I said, would you please let them know I'm here? I'll be at the funeral home at 10 o'clock. Sure. Well, it was an answering service that did that. And so I get around in the morning, I make way to the funeral home, and their two nieces stand out in the driveway, and they said, oh, thank goodness you're here. We were wondering where you were. Nobody had told them anything. The happy part of the story was we had a great memorial service. I got to share the gospel, talk about a gospel journey of this young man that I got to introduce to Jesus back in February, not knowing he was going to go into eternity at this point in time. So anyway, my plan B was figure it out as I go along and trust that God is going to make it happen. And he did. And the good news is my return trip was seamless. On time, on a plane that only had 25% people on it, and got home and glad for the trip. So what's the spiritual message in that? Sometimes you don't know how it's going to work. Sometimes you don't know how you're going to get there. But you keep putting one foot in front of the other one and trust that God is going to make a way. And guess what? And he can do that. All right, so that was then. This is now. I'm glad to be back with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to share this time with you. I'm glad I can still read the clock back there. So I want to... if we're going to entitle a message today, and I've gone through several different iterations of titles, I would entitle this a pay it forward plan. A pay it forward plan. Because what we do as a church and what we do as believers is not about what happened yesterday. It's about what happens today and what our plans are for tomorrow. Are we preparing ourselves? Are we doing, in a gospel framework, a strategy and a plan that's about what is next and who is actually next? So the passage is, I'm going to put this up on the screen. Dave is going to help me, and I'm going to read this so you're looking at the same words. This is out of the New American Standard Translation of John chapter 1, beginning in verse 35. Again, the next day, John was standing with two of his disciples, and he looked at Jesus as he walked and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God." The two disciples heard him speak, and they followed Jesus. Jesus turned and saw them following and said to them, "What do you seek?" They said to him, "Rabbi," which translated means teacher, "where are you staying?" He said to them, "Come and you will see." So they came and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him that day, for it was about the 10th hour. One of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He found first his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which translated means Christ. He brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, the son of John. You shall be called Cephas," which is translated Peter. So go ahead and put the next slide up there, David, if you can. So this is a breakdown because I'm watching the time and I'm reading. I have a story to tell. Because actually, in thinking about our time together, if you go back and look at the Gospels, in Jesus' ministry, he always gave a spiritual principle and then he told stories. Because he's trying to connect people's understanding of life with spiritually significant issues. And so that's what we're going to do. So if we're going to break down this passage, indulge me as we walk through this, there's an encounter to be had and a story to be told. In this account, the first encounter was with who? Was with John the Baptist. John, who came out of the wilderness preaching repentance, and he gathered people, came alongside him as disciples, which was very common in that day. If you had somebody that presented themselves with spiritual knowledge and stature, some people would come alongside of them. They would refer to them as a rabbi, and they would simply follow and listen to their teaching. And so that happened with John. While he's preaching repentance, there are people who come alongside. And so we encounter some men who have encountered John the Baptist. They like what they hear. They believe in him as a spiritual guide of some sort. And then while they're standing with John, who should appear on the scene but Jesus? And John points to him and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God takes away the sins of the world." And they left John to follow Jesus. So there was an encounter to be had and a story to be told. They had an encounter with John, but the story to be told that John wasn't the Messiah. The story to be told was that you see that guy right there. That is the Messiah. And then there's someone to tell. And you see there, I put a square up there besides tell because you can read that linguistically in one of two ways. You have to have someone to do the telling. Somebody has to do the telling. In the first case, John did the telling. In the second case, of those two who were with him and heard him point out Jesus, one of them was Andrew. And Andrew became the teller. So you have to have someone to do the telling, but then you have to have someone to tell the story to. And this is the beauty of this passage. It says that when Andrew had his encounter with Jesus, again, another encounter and a story to be told, what did he do? He immediately went and found whom? His brother. His brother. And said to him, "We found the guy. We got the guy. The Messiah is here." You have someone to do the telling, and then you have someone to have been told. In this case, you have Andrew who encountered John, who encountered Jesus, and who told his brother Peter, Cephas, at that point in time. And then you have an encounter to be had and a story to be told. You see, there's a pattern. You see a pattern here? The pattern is that someone is looking for something, and they have an encounter with somebody that gives them the answers that they're looking for. And as a result of that encounter, they go and find somebody else to tell about the encounter they had so that that person can have the encounter, so that they too can go and find somebody to tell, so that that person can have the encounter. Here we are 2,000 years after the fact, and is that not what we're supposed to be doing? Now the question is, are we actually effectively doing that? What does it look like in 2022 for those of us who claim the name of Christ? What does that cycle look like, and where are we in that cycle? You know, we could break down this passage even further and say, well, you know, the reason that Andrew went to who he went to the most important person in his life. His brother, Cephas, was to him the most important person. If you know anything about what's called concentric circles of concern, that we all are not isolated people. We have people in our lives, but they're in varying degrees of relationship with us. We have the intimate core that, you know, is usually represented by 3 to 10 people. Sometimes they could be family members and sometimes they can be friends. These are the people that we're willing to let close to us and in. And then outside that, you have a larger circle of people that you know fairly well, but you don't hang out with them. And then outside of that, so you have these concentric circles that people are removed from us varying degrees in our social relationships and emotional relationships with them. We start where we start with the people who are close to us. And then when we've shared with those, then what do? We go to that next layer of people sharing with us. So here's the question for us as we're sharing this journey of exploration. You know, I'm the substitute teacher again, and we're talking about these biblical principles. And so the question is, how have I seen this played out? How have I been a part of this story? Repeated pattern in the course of life and doing ministry. Yeah. Hold that thought, because I've been dying to tell this story for a year now, okay? I was hoping to tell it at Somerville. It just didn't work out. To the men's meeting, it just didn't work out. Other places just didn't work out. So guess what? You get to hear this story, because it's about this exact account here. Because unfortunately, historically, and correct me if I'm wrong, that in most cases in a church environment, it's assumed that the preacher is the primary teller. Wouldn't that be true? He's the evangelist, he's the teacher, he's the prophet, he's all of those kind of things. And so in a lot of cases, churches hire ministers to minister. And what does that mean everybody else does? They let them minister. The call of the gospel is not to professional prophets. The call of the gospel is to everyone who's had an encounter. You know, the call of the gospel, even to John the Baptist, was not to be the guy, but to be the one who pointed to the guy. And then those disciples who came along and hung out with John, they heard him say, I'm not the guy, that's the guy. And when they had that encounter with that guy, it was to go and tell that story to somebody else who could have an encounter with that guy. None of these were professionals. What was Andrew professionally? What was Andrew? He was a fisherman. He was a redneck in those days. He was a fisherman. How qualified was he to do this? If he had relationships with people that needed an encounter with God, he was eminently qualified to do that. If there were people that he cared about in his life and their eternal relationship with God, he was what? He was eminently qualified to do that. If he could communicate about fish, he could communicate about having encountered the Messiah. So it's not about this food chain of people and their qualification to be the teller. Anybody who has relationships and has had the encounter is not just qualified, but you're called to be the teller. And there are people in your life that need to be told. And then those people in your life, when they have the encounter, then that's a pay it forward. That doesn't mean you stop paying. That means you just find somebody else to pay it forward to until you've exhausted that. But what you will find out in your life and in your circle, in your environment, it is never exhausted, because there's always going to be one more and one more and one more. So let me take the sort of the time to flesh out this story and tell you something about our journey. And this is just going to be a brief slice of that journey where I have seen this principle of paying it forward actually played out, fleshed out. That was when in 1990, I was invited to go and pastor a church in Maryland. Now, I didn't necessarily want to go to Maryland. I asked everybody I knew to tell me about Maryland, and they said it's the place that people move away from, not a place that people move to. I had heard Billy Graham did a crusade there in 1963. He called Baltimore the preacher's graveyard. Well, that's not a commendation, a place that you want to go. And yet the Lord gave me two choices. He said, either you can go and be happy or go and be miserable. Guess what? You're going to go. So you decide what it's going to be. Well, I got enough misery without inviting more, so it's like, okay, we will go and do that. And so we went, but I went having had a sort of a transformation in my own principles of leadership and preaching and teaching and advancing the gospel. So we went into an established church there, but freed to do this very kind of thing. And we were at that church for 3 years. And we saw God just pour out a blessing on that environment. Now, we broke a lot of rules. You just need to know that. I'm the guy that, you know, if you show me where the fence is, I'll be looking for the gate, all right? I'm the guy. And I won't ask for permission to go through the gate. So God poured out a blessing on us while we were there. We met this couple who were a part of that church. Now, Bill and Barbara Rhodes, Julie, when you see this, I hope this blesses you. They were the salt of the earth kind of people. Bill worked at General Motors. Barbara was a librarian. They were the worker bees in the church. They weren't the teachers. They weren't the deacons. They weren't the leaders. They were just salt of the earth people who came and served wherever there was a need to be served. And Barbara, during the tax season of the year, she was among that sea of people that that gets hired by H&R Block to do people's taxes. I don't know if you've ever paid them to do that, but anyway, she was one of those, and so she was doing this on the side to make money. Well, while she was doing this, she met two other ladies that were doing exactly the same thing. And this is where the marker board comes in, because this is a tree you need to follow its forks. Are you with me? So I'm going to start over here because the flow is going to go this way for a reason. So we have Barb, who works at H&R Block. And Barb encounters two women there. One is Margaret, and the other is Nellie. Now, Margaret and Barb were close to the same age. Nellie was a generation removed. She was the previous generation. But anyway, so she met these two ladies working at H&R Block. And so what did she do? She invited them to church, Margaret and Nellie. And so we are at this, and let me put this up here. This is First Baptist Church of Brooklyn, which is in the south side of Baltimore. So they invited, and they came to that church where God was pouring out a blessing. Now, to show you some of the kind of thing that God was doing in this framework is that this church, I introduced Evangelism Explosion to teach people how to reach people. And at one time, on one Sunday morning, we had 19 people to baptize. Are you with me? That's pretty exciting stuff, isn't it? You'd think people would be dancing in the aisles going, man, hallelujah, God's just touched all those people. They only had a dozen baptismal robes. You know, the white robes that look like you're an angel, or supposed to? They didn't have enough robes. And so somebody said, Pastor, what are we going to do? I said, they got saved in their street clothes. They'll get baptized in their street clothes. And so we baptized them. Some people in that church never forgave me for that, because for them it was more important that they be in that white robe than they made a commitment to Christ. And so they got a mad on about that. Well, anyway, so they came into this environment. And then, we're going to come back to Nellie. Margaret had two sisters, Nancy and Lori. Nancy was the older sister. If you want to know what Nancy was like, if you're familiar with the Andy Griffith Show and the Fun Girls that always got Barney in trouble, she was one of the Fun Girls. Looked like it, sounded like that. And then Lori was the youngest, so Margaret was the middle one here. So I dubbed them the Three Stooges, because they were like inseparable. So they came in this framework. It was during this time that we left, and the Lord led us in 1993 to plant the North Arundel Church, which was a church that I was led to do that was engineered to reach unchurched people. It was a church not designed to do church, but to do a pay-it-forward plan. To find the next person that needs Jesus, tell them about the encounter so they can have the encounter, so they can tell the next person about Jesus who needs to have the encounter so they can tell the next person about Jesus. Are you with me? Have I lost anybody yet? All right. So there is this line right here between the past and the present. So you have these three sisters, and in the Nellie, this is probably I'm going to guess this was in 1992. So let's put that up here. That the Lord led us to plant a church. And so I invited that church there and said, why don't we do this together? Why don't you be a sponsoring church and let's plant this so that it's a win-win for everybody? And the answer was, thanks, but no thanks. You want to do it, God bless you, go and do it. So we did it. So once we launched this church, is that Lori brought Nevin, her husband. I think Nevin had probably been raised in the Greek church. He was a Greek background, had that sort of feature. But Nevin was he installed cyclotrons for Johns Hopkins University, traveled all over the planet to install these equipment. He didn't have a doctorate in anything. All the guys that worked under him had doctorates, not him. But anyway, so Nevin was a real smart guy. So he came. And then in that first fall of 1993, when this was launched, we did our first baptism. We started with about 30 people who left the other church and wanted to be a part of this church plant, and so that's what we did. In that first group, we borrowed one of the local Baptist churches and had a baptism service there on a Sunday night. Among those that we baptized, I got to baptize Margaret, Nancy, Lori, and Nevin. Y'all pardon me, because this still moves me, because these people are, they're dear to my heart. But I got to see what God was doing. All right, we're going to step down here to Nellie. So Nellie, Nellie was in her 70s at that point in time. And Nellie was a believer. She had just gotten away from God. And so this was her return to faith. Well, she started attending, and her husband, who was an agnostic, his name was Carl, who went by the name of Bud. He had no interest in church. He had no interest in God. He had lived his life. He was pretty satisfied. But anyway, Carl started coming with his wife, Nellie. And I would say, because I'm always looking for the new face in the crowd. God is blessing. People are coming, and I'd see him when she was there. And then when she didn't make it, if she was sick, there sat Bud by himself. And one day I went to him, I said, Bud, I said, I know what you come with your wife, Nellie, when she comes. I said, why do you come when she doesn't come? He looked at me, he said, I like to hear you talk. I'm good with that. I'm glad you like to hear me talk. We'll pick up this story later. And so at that same time, let's get back here. You have Nancy, who has a son, who has a romantic relationship. That's as gentle as we can put it, with a girl by the name of Alicia. Alicia was Jewish. She lived in Rockville, Maryland, which is it's a suburb of D.C. She was a dietitian at the local hospital. Well, because Nancy cared about Alicia, Nancy's son could have cared less about anything spiritual. But Alicia was interested, and so Nancy invited Alicia to come, and so Alicia started coming to the church. She would drive from Rockville, whatever it was, 50 miles or something, to come up to the church. And we started small groups, and so I was leading a small group, and so Alicia was one of those that showed up at this small group. I think it was on a Tuesday night. Also, from Nellie, I think it was the 3rd December we were there. We were having some sort of a Christmas program, and Nellie, Susan, was a daughter who'd been raised as the wild child. Susan had been an addict. She had done the wild thing. She was married to an Italian named Pasquale. And anyway, so Nellie kept writing her daughter back, you need to come, you need to come, you need to come, you need to come. And Susan said, I came for the Christmas program just to get Mom off my back. Does that sound familiar? I'm going to go, say I don't like it, the end of story, going back my life. But she came, and something happened. She started attending the same small group that I was leading, in which Alicia and some others were. And she was, I think, 5 years older than us, something like that. And she used to sit on the floor. Other people sitting around, she'd sit on the floor, and we'd have an hour study, and then afterwards we'd have conversation. And I looked at her one time, I said, Susan, why are you here? She said, I don't know, there's just something that rings true about this. And that was it. Let her be where she was. Over the course of the time, and we're going to have to condense this in the interest of our own time, because we're going to run out of time, is that, I think this happened first. Susan, she left her husband and moved off to Connecticut, ran off with another guy. She sent word by her mom, a message to Pastor James. Would you ask Pastor James to help find a church like his in Connecticut? And I said, Nellie, you tell Susan she can run away from Pastor James, but she can't run away from God. Nellie said, I will. It wasn't long after that, Nellie called me and said, can I meet you? I met her at our space, and she took one of our brochures and showed it to me. Susan had written a suicide note on our brochure, and she intended to end her life, and she tried and failed. They brought her back down to our area, put her in a treatment place, and her mom said, Susan would like to see you. So I went to Crofton and went into the conference room with Susan and sat down, and I said, so Susan, what happened? She said, I blew it this time. I said, what do you think you need to do? She said, you know what? I've tried everything else. I think maybe it's time for me to try Jesus. Got to pray with her. She committed her heart to Jesus. Whew. Alicia. She's coming. When I go visit the hospital where she was working, I encounter her there. And I met with her, and well, she wanted to become a member of our church. And I met with her. I said, Alicia, I said, you've got to settle the issue of who Jesus is. I mean, you're Jewish. You're going to have to confess that Jesus is the Messiah. Really? I said, yeah. I said, so here's the Bible. Read the Gospel of John, and then let's follow up with it. So I gave her a couple of weeks, and I went back and saw her, and I said, so where are you? She says, I'm ready to confess that Jesus is the Messiah. And there at the hospital, I got to pray with her, and she committed her heart to Jesus. Wow. All right. That's two T's. Miss Hattie. Miss Hattie was Nellie's sister. Miss Hattie started coming. She'd sit in the service, she'd attend. She went through our membership class one time, and we got down to the end, make a commitment, and she asked me, she said, do I have to believe the Bible in order to be a member of this church? Yeah, Miss Hattie, you have to. She broke down and cried and left the room because she couldn't confess that she believed the Bible. She and her husband were snowbirds. He was a retired, I think, fireman. They went to Florida every winter. And so they went to Florida, and I get a letter from her, and it's somewhere in my archives of documents, where she wrote me and she said, Pastor James, I just want to let you know, the last Sunday I was at church before coming to Florida. She said, we were singing that song, We Believe in God and Say We Need Jesus. She said, and for the first time in my life, I realized that's what I needed. And I've given my heart to Christ. She was 69 years old when she did that. Miss Hattie came back, and she was a joy to us. Very smart woman. She had been a flower child back in the 60s. She had been a wild child. So anyway, Hattie had a husband, Al. Al had a prosthetic leg, and so all the places that we had met up until like the third stop along the way had stairs, and so he couldn't climb the stairs. So we finally got on ground level. Miss Hattie made and I used to go out and see her, and I'd visit with Al. Became friends with him. Walked through cancer with him and other things with him. And one day, I don't remember how long it was in there, that I went into their home and I looked at Brother Al and I said, I just need to know, are you ready to do business with Jesus? And Al said yes. I got to pray with Al when he made his commitment to Christ. Nancy's husband was named Chris. Chris was retired from, I don't know what. Chris was a likable kind of character, but he was an agnostic too. And so he started coming periodically to the church. And we built a relationship, and anytime we had a project, he was there to help us do it. And I'm trying to condense the story to squeeze it into the time allotted, so just indulge me at this point. We'd relocated several times till we ran out of places big enough that we could rent. We ended up at the local high school. Seat 1,400 people in that auditorium. And one Sunday morning, we had a full worship band, and we had a young man playing drums. And his drum kit was like, he had 100 drums or something. I think Greg, was that his name? So we get up and we start one of the service one morning, and Greg says, can I say something? Now, y'all need to know that's always a danger sign, a warning sign. If somebody that's unscripted and unplanned says, I want to say something. But in the moment, I thought, okay. So gave him a microphone, and sitting up on the stage, having done this worship set, he said, I want to confess to y'all that the whole time I've been working with the worship band here, I've been using marijuana. Well, so you know what happened? My sermon plans that day, it went out the window. Because it's like everybody's sitting there just dumbstruck. What's the pastor going to do? And so I talked about sin and being a slave to sin. And I gave an altar call. People poured down the front. Chris was one of those who gave his heart to Jesus that day. Margaret's husband, George. George and Chris are brother-in-laws, but they're more like brothers. They did everything together when they weren't working. George was a painter, commercial painter, always a friend to help, but George was an agnostic. He didn't have any use for God, any use for the church. He was okay for his wife to do that kind of stuff. But anyway, so got to know George. And somewhere along the way, George had a heart attack. And I went to visit him in the hospital in Columbia. He's in there in the intensive care, and I went in there and I said, you know how bad it is? He said, yeah, they tell me it's really bad. I said, here's the deal, George. Here's the deal I'm willing to make with you. I'll pray that God restores your health if you promise to give me time afterwards to talk to you about Jesus. He said, we can do that. Guess what? God restored him. He went home, resumed his life. I'd see him. He started coming to church. I'd see him. I said, are you ready? He said, I'm not ready yet. I don't know, it may have been 6 months, it may have been a year. Finally, he said, it's time. I went by the house and got to share the gospel with George. And George committed his heart to Jesus Christ. Carl. Sometime in that same window of time, Carl ended up in the hospital. I don't remember exactly what his condition was, but he was every bit of 80 years old. And so I went up to the hospital and I asked the family, I said, would y'all excuse us, leave the room and give Bud and I some just private time? And so the family that knew me, they knew what was coming. And so they all left the room, and I went in and I got over by Carl's bed and I got down. He had the biggest blue eyes and looking up at me. And I said, Bud, have they told you how bad it is? He said, no. I said, do you suspect how bad it is? He said, yeah. I said, we've been talking about this a long time, about you and Jesus. I said, what do you want to do? He looked at me. He said, Pastor James, I want to go with you. I said, I want you to go too. Carl prayed, committed his heart to Jesus Christ. And I think this is the last one in this tree. Lori and Nevin. I think that was Lori's son, Mark. In time, Mark made a commitment of faith to Jesus Christ. You see how pay it forward works? It starts with one person who has an encounter and goes tell somebody else to have an encounter. And somebody who's just a worker bee, not a queen bee, not a leader, just somebody who's willing to be faithful to what God has called them to do. And if one person God can use to touch all those lives, is it a small wonder that when Jesus picked 12 and one of them was the devil, out of those 11 that left, they were able to set the world on fire with the gospel? Because they told somebody who told somebody who told somebody who finally told us. The question is for you as a church as we bring this in for a landing. Where is your commitment? What are the principles? What are the driving forces going forward in the kind of church you want to be, in the place you are, and what God would have you to do? Bow your heads as we come to this time of commitment. And I don't know what it is the Lord would have you to do in response. This is simply a time to do that. I'm going to be here if you feel like you need to talk to me or come and pray. But you do what it is that the Spirit is prompting you to do. Father, I thank you that while the journey's not necessarily been easy, it's been blessed. That for my wife and I, we've gotten to experience so much of your working in the lives of people around us. is we continue simply to do the next thing in obedience that you've called us to do. And I thank you for all the Barbs that we have known, who were just simple people of faith who didn't keep it to themselves. But that you led us to provide a system and an environment that all those people that needed Jesus could come and their guards could be dropped and lowered and they could hear the gospel message and respond and say yes to Jesus. And now in this moment, Lord, help us respond as you would lead us to, that your will would be accomplished among these people in this church. It's in Jesus' name we pray and for his sake. Amen.